October 12, 1957, the Peabody Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. Chuck Berry stood in the marble lobby holding his Gibson guitar case and a leather suitcase, watching the desk clerk's face transform from professional politeness to something colder. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't accommodate colored guests. You'll need to find other arrangements." The words hung in the air like cigarette smoke, heavy and bitter. Chuck's band members, waiting by the entrance, exchanged knowing looks. They'd been through this routine a dozen times before. Find a boarding house on Beale Street, split the cost, make do. But Chuck wasn't moving toward the door. Instead, he was reaching into his jacket pocket for something that would turn the South's most prestigious hotel upside down. The Peabody wasn't just any hotel. This was where Elvis Presley had celebrated his first RCA contract, where Jerry Lee Lewis had played impromptu concerts in the lobby, where Sun Records artists stayed when they wanted to feel like they'd made it. The ducks that lived in the fountain were more famous than most musicians, and the penthouse suite overlooked the Mississippi River like a throne room. Chuck Berry had earned the right to stay here. His records were selling better than most white artists. Maybelline had hit number 5 on the pop charts. Roll Over Beethoven was playing on radio stations across the country. But in October 1957, success didn't change the color of your skin, and the color of Chuck's skin meant he wasn't welcome at the Peabody Hotel, no matter how many records he'd sold. The desk clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses named Harold Whitman, had delivered the rejection with practiced efficiency. He'd probably said the same words to other black performers who'd tried to stay at the Peabody. Maybe he'd even taken pleasure in it. Harold had been working at the hotel for 8 years, had seen the music business change, watched as black artists started getting famous with white audiences. He didn't like the changes, liked them even less when those artists started thinking they could stay in the same hotels as decent white folks. Chuck looked at Harold for a long moment, studying him with those sharp, calculating eyes that had made Chess Records executives nervous. Then Chuck smiled. Not the wide showman smile he used on stage, but something smaller, more dangerous. "Harold," Chuck said, reading the nameplate on the desk, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Chuck's band was already heading for the door. Johnny Johnson, his piano player, had started walking toward what he assumed would be another familiar indignity. They'd find a place on the black side of town, pay too much for rooms that weren't clean enough, and pretend it didn't bother them. That's how it worked in 1957. That's how it had always worked. But Chuck wasn't following them. He was still standing at that marble desk, still smiling that unsettling smile. "I need to make a phone call," Chuck said to Harold. "You have a payphone in this establishment?" Harold pointed toward a wooden booth near the hotel's restaurant, probably assuming Chuck was calling to arrange alternative accommodations. Chuck nodded politely, walked to the phone booth, and dialed a number he'd memorized but never used. The conversation lasted exactly 4 minutes. Nobody in the lobby could hear what Chuck said, but they could see him through the booth's glass, gesturing with his free hand like he was explaining something important to someone who needed to understand completely. When Chuck emerged from the phone booth, Harold was helping other guests check in, pointedly ignoring the black musician who should have already left the building. Chuck walked back to the desk and waited patiently until Harold finished with a middle-aged white couple from Nashville. "Excuse me, Harold," Chuck said quietly. "I believe someone wants to speak with you." Harold looked confused. "I'm sorry, speak with me about what?" Chuck gestured toward the front desk telephone, which was ringing. Harold picked it up with obvious irritation. "Peabody Hotel, this is Harold speaking." What happened next would be talked about in Memphis music circles for decades. Harold's face went white, then red, then white again. His hands started trembling so badly he could barely hold the receiver. He kept saying "yes sir" and "no sir" and "I understand completely sir," in a voice that got smaller with each word. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. When Harold hung up, his wire-rimmed glasses were fogged with perspiration. He looked at Chuck Berry like he was seeing him for the first time. "Mr. Berry," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Of course we have accommodation available for you. Our finest suite, actually." Chuck nodded as if this outcome had been inevitable. "The penthouse?" he asked. "Yes, sir. The penthouse. Complimentary, of course." As an apology for any confusion, Harold was already pulling keys from behind the desk, his hands still shaking. "And your band members, naturally, will need rooms for them as well, also complimentary." Chuck turned toward his band, who were standing frozen by the entrance, trying to understand what they'd just witnessed. "Boys," Chuck called out, "bring the equipment up. We're staying." But who had Chuck called? What 3 words could transform the South's most segregated hotel into Chuck Berry's personal welcome committee? The answer lay in Chuck's understanding of how power really worked in 1957 Memphis. It wasn't about civil rights or moral arguments. It was about money, influence, and knowing which dominoes to push. Chuck had called Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis Presley's manager, the most powerful man in the Memphis music industry, the man who could make or break careers with a single phone call, the man who owed Chuck Berry a favor that he'd been avoiding for 6 months. Parker had been dodging Chuck's calls since spring, when Chuck had caught him stealing from Elvis. Not money, credit. Parker had been telling people that Elvis had written Hound Dog and That's All Right, when Chuck knew damn well where those songs had really come from. Chuck had never planned to expose Parker. But Parker didn't know that. Parker thought Chuck was holding a loaded gun to his reputation. The phone call had been simple. "Tom, it's Chuck Berry. I'm standing in the Peabody Hotel lobby and they're telling me they don't have rooms for colored guests." Now I could call up Sam Phillips at Sun Records and tell him about our conversation regarding Elvis's songwriting credits. Or you could call this hotel and explain to them why Chuck Berry needs to be treated like the star he is. Your choice. Parker had chosen wisely. He'd called the hotel owner, a man named Benjamin Morrison, who happened to be one of Parker's poker buddies and who owned 3 other hotels that depended on Parker's clients for business. Morrison had called the hotel manager. The hotel manager had called Harold. And Harold had received a very clear message. Chuck Berry gets whatever Chuck Berry wants, or Harold would be looking for a new job by morning. The beauty of Chuck's strategy wasn't just that it worked. It was that Parker couldn't complain about being blackmailed without admitting why he was vulnerable to blackmail in the first place. The penthouse suite at the Peabody Hotel was everything the lobby had promised. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Mississippi River. A baby grand piano that Johnny Johnson immediately started playing. Room service that arrived without being asked for, because the hotel manager was so terrified of disappointing Chuck that he'd ordered the kitchen to prepare their finest dinner. Chuck's band members walked through the rooms like they'd stumbled into a dream. They'd played to packed houses, had hit records on the radio, but they'd never been treated like royalty. They'd certainly never stayed anywhere that white musicians stayed. "Chuck," Johnny said, still playing the piano, "how'd you do that? What'd you say on that phone call?" Chuck was standing by the windows, looking out at the river, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. "Sometimes the trick isn't being the strongest person in the room," he said. "Sometimes the trick is knowing who the strongest person is afraid of." But what Chuck didn't tell Johnny was the full story behind that phone call. The favor Chuck held over Colonel Parker wasn't just about songwriting credits. It was about something much more dangerous. 3 months earlier, Chuck had been recording at Sun Studios when he'd overheard Parker on the phone with a radio station owner in Jackson, Mississippi. Parker had been arranging for certain black artists to be delayed in their bookings, ensuring white artists got better time slots. Parker had been systematically sabotaging black musicians' careers while publicly supporting integration. Chuck had recorded that conversation on a small tape recorder he'd started carrying for song ideas. Parker knew Chuck had that tape. Parker knew it could destroy not just his career but his relationship with Elvis, who genuinely believed his manager supported all musicians equally. The tape was Chuck's insurance policy. He'd never intended to use it for something as simple as a hotel room. But the humiliation at the Peabody front desk had triggered something deeper than anger. Chuck had grown tired of being treated like a second-class citizen while his music made other people rich. If he had power, real power, he was going to start using it. The phone call to Parker had been a test, a way to measure exactly how much leverage he had. Turned out he had more than he'd realized. Within an hour of Chuck's check-in, the hotel manager personally visited the penthouse to ensure everything was satisfactory. The man practically genuflected. Chuck had never seen a white man so eager to please a black musician. It was almost embarrassing. Almost. "Mr. Berry," the manager said, twisting his hat in his hands, "if there's anything at all you or your band needs during your stay, please don't hesitate to call the front desk. We want your experience here to be absolutely perfect." Chuck studied the man's face, reading the fear behind the obsequiousness. "I appreciate that, Mr. Patterson. One thing, though, I notice your restaurant doesn't serve black guests." Patterson's face went pale. "Well, that's always been our policy." "Starting tomorrow," Chuck said quietly. "That policy changes. Any musician performing in Memphis, regardless of color, can dine in your restaurant. That seems fair, don't you think?" Patterson nodded so vigorously Chuck worried he might injure his neck. "Of course, Mr. Berry, absolutely. I'll inform the kitchen staff immediately." But the real transformation was happening in Harold Whitman. The desk clerk who'd rejected Chuck just hours earlier was now personally delivering fresh towels to the penthouse, apologizing repeatedly for the misunderstanding. Harold's entire worldview was crumbling. He'd believed that segregation existed because it was natural, inevitable, the way things had to be. Watching Chuck Berry orchestrate his own VIP treatment with a single phone call had revealed the system's true foundation, not natural order, but carefully maintained power structures that could be dismantled by anyone who understood how they worked. Harold found himself wondering what other natural rules were actually just business arrangements that could be renegotiated by the right person with the right leverage. That night, Chuck performed at Ellis Auditorium. The venue was still segregated, with a rope down the center aisle, but something had changed backstage. Word had spread through Memphis's tight music community about what had happened at the Peabody. The venue manager treated Chuck like visiting royalty. His dressing room was the largest and best appointed. Security escorted him personally. Other musicians, both black and white, stopped by to pay their respects. They sensed that Chuck had achieved something unprecedented, respect through power rather than talent. During the performance, Chuck noticed something unusual. The rope down the center aisle seemed looser than usual. Security wasn't enforcing the separation as strictly. A few white teenagers near the dividing line were swaying to the music, moving closer to the black section. By the third song, the rope was meaningless. The audience had naturally integrated itself, united by the music while security looked the other way. After the show, Chuck found Harold Whitman waiting backstage. The desk clerk was out of uniform, wearing a cheap suit and nervous expression. "Mr. Berry, I wanted to apologize properly for this afternoon. What I said, how I treated you, it wasn't right." Chuck studied Harold's face, looking for signs of insincerity. He found none, just embarrassment and what looked like genuine remorse. "Harold, you were doing your job, following the rules you'd been taught." "No, sir," Harold said firmly. "I was being cruel because I thought I could get away with it, because I thought you couldn't fight back. That's not the same thing as following rules." Chuck nodded slowly. Harold's honesty was unexpected and more valuable than his apology. "What changed your mind, Harold?" Harold hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Watching you today, I realized that everything I'd been told about why things are the way they are, maybe those were lies. Maybe the people in charge don't stay in charge because they're supposed to. Maybe they stay in charge because people like me help them." The conversation with Harold lasted 20 minutes. Chuck learned that the desk clerk had a younger brother who played guitar, who loved Chuck's records but had never been able to see a live show because colored concerts were held in venues Harold's family couldn't afford. Harold had never connected his brother's disappointment to his own actions at the hotel desk. Chuck's demonstration of power had forced Harold to see the connections, to understand that segregation wasn't a natural law but a system that required Harold's daily participation to survive. By the end of their conversation, Harold wasn't just apologizing, he was asking Chuck how he could help dismantle the system he'd been unconsciously supporting. Chuck gave Harold a piece of advice that would change both their lives. "Find other people like your brother, people who love the music more than they fear change. Help them see what you saw today." 3 weeks later, Harold Whitman quit his job at the Peabody Hotel. He used his savings to open a small club on the outskirts of Memphis, a venue that catered to mixed audiences who wanted to hear black music performed by black artists. The club struggled financially at first, but Harold had learned something about leverage from watching Chuck Berry. He started booking white musicians who performed Chuck's songs, advertising them as performing the music of the great Chuck Berry. White audiences came to hear the familiar songs. Once they were there, Harold would introduce black musicians who played original material in similar styles. Slowly, methodically, Harold built an audience that came for the music regardless of who was performing it. Chuck's week at the Peabody established a template that other black musicians began following. They started making strategic phone calls before arriving in segregated cities, using their connections in the music industry to pressure hotels and venues into compliance. They stopped accepting separate and unequal treatment as the price of musical success. Some faced violent resistance, some were banned from certain cities entirely, but others found that the system was more fragile than it appeared, that the right pressure applied to the right people could create sudden dramatic change. Chuck had shown them that power didn't require violence or confrontation, it required understanding who was afraid of what, and why. By December 1957, the Peabody Hotel was quietly advertising itself as Memphis's premier accommodation for recording artists of distinction. The phrase was code. Every musician in the South understood what it meant. Black artist welcome if they had sufficient industry clout. It wasn't integration in any meaningful sense, it was business pragmatism, but it was also the beginning of something larger. Harold's club was thriving. Other venues were experimenting with mixed audiences. Radio stations were playing Chuck's records alongside Elvis's without apology. The old system was still in place, but it was developing cracks that would eventually become chasms. The phone call that changed everything lasted 4 minutes and cost Chuck 25 cents. But the real cost was higher than that. Chuck had traded his safety for his dignity. Every white person in Memphis now knew that Chuck Berry was someone who could make things happen with a phone call. That made him valuable to some people and dangerous to others. From that October day forward, Chuck was watched more carefully, followed more often, and targeted more specifically by those who wanted to preserve the old order. The FBI would open a file on him within 6 months. Southern sheriffs would start looking for excuses to arrest him. The price of respect was a target on his back. Chuck had known this when he made that phone call. He'd chosen dignity over safety because he'd understood something that most people never learn. In a rigged system, safety is an illusion anyway. Years later, when the Civil Rights Act officially ended segregation in public accommodations, reporters would credit the courage of protesters and the vision of political leaders. They wouldn't mention Chuck Berry's phone call from the Peabody Hotel lobby or Harold Whitman's mixed audience club or the dozens of small victories that had preceded the larger legislative triumph. But Chuck didn't need the credit. He'd gotten what he'd really wanted, proof that the system could be beaten by anyone smart enough to understand how it really worked. The hotel that said no had become the hotel that carried his bags to the penthouse, and that lesson, that single demonstration of power and leverage, had taught an entire generation of musicians that they didn't have to accept unacceptable treatment just because it had always been unacceptable before.